Welcome to Maine Voices Livestream. Before we begin, some messages from our sponsors. Stroudwater Lodge is an independent and assisted living community located just minutes from downtown Portland. Residents love the spirit of the lodge, enjoying the privacy of their own apartment and all the benefits of a full-service community with easy access to fabulous dining, entertainment, and shopping. Stroudwater Lodge is just a stone's throw from their sister community, Avita of Stroudwater, which focuses on memory care.
When you're out in the wild, or you're on the water, or you're looking at an island that was formed hundreds of thousands of years ago, you realize that we're only here for a flash of time. And you also learn, the older you get, if you're lucky enough to get old, is that it starts to accelerate really fast. We've had the privilege of working with some families for over 5 generations. So we know when someone is trying to make a decision about who to trust their legacy with, that it's one of the biggest decisions that they'll ever confront. We are disciplined investors and strategic family trust planners. We've managed wealth for generations, and we are grateful for the trust families have given us. This is patience. This is discipline. This is trust. This is H.M. Payson.
And now we'll turn things over to Lisa DeSisto.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's great to see people already populating the chat and letting us know where you're joining us from tonight. I would like to thank again our sponsors, H.M. Payson, Stroudwater Lodge, and Hub Furniture. Their generosity supports this series and also our journalism. And speaking of our journalism, I hope you've had an opportunity to read our series on the lobster industry that we published in collaboration with the Boston Globe. It's extraordinary work about the future of one of Maine's most vital industries. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's guest and host. Gabriel Frey is a 12th generation Passamaquoddy black ash basket maker. He specializes in utility baskets with a modern approach. Growing up in a basket making family, he learned traditional weaving techniques at a young age, as well as the importance of self-expression through traditional basket making art form. It is a skill he has been honing for more than 22 years. Suzanne Greenlaw is a citizen of the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians and a PhD candidate at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. She is an ethnobotanist focused on mobilizing Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices to address Indigenous cultural resource issues such as reduced access, invasive species planning, and restoration of traditional gathering practices. They recently published a new children's book, The First Blade of Sweetgrass, and we'll chat about it tonight with our staff writer, Ray Routhier, who has been writing about pop culture, TV, entertainment, music, and lifestyle for the Press Herald for more than 23 years. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and please welcome Suzanne, Gabriel, and Ray.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, Suzanne. Hi, Gabe. How are you guys doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Good. And I think I'd like to just start off by asking you specifically about the book, and maybe for people who don't know what it's about, it's basically a children's book about harvesting sweetgrass. So I wanted to ask specifically what the prompting for writing the book was, where the idea came from to do this or to do a book like this.
Yeah, well, I guess there's multiple things that happened to kind of was to produce this book for us, or why we did it. We have 2 small children, or 2 younger children, and we were quoted in starting off with this talk about mentioning that we couldn't find children's books that really represented children like our children, I guess, or Native children, or feeling we were really struggling to find more than a handful of Wabanaki children's stories. And that was a struggle that we felt for a couple of years. I mean, never did we think, oh, well, we could just write a book instead. That wasn't.
No, the process was always like being aware of trying to seek out these books and and being aware of the fact that it was a challenge. So it was never like, well, let's just do it ourselves, but it was more like, how do we find things that express their voice or their experiences in life in a children's book form?
Which, I mean, we had bought a lot of children's books. Like, we love reading to our children, of the, creating those stories and that practice for them. And we wanted Wabanaki stories. And we also don't want to discredit the stories that are out there for Wabanaki, from Wabanaki authors. Like, there's like a handful of really beautiful Wabanaki stories. We just wanted more. We just felt really limited by the number we found. And then I had published, or there was a published article about the research I was doing in Acadia National Park. So I worked to restore sweetgrass gathering in Acadia National Park. And the editor emailed me and was like, do you think you have a story in this research?
Jonathan Eaton of Tilbury House Publishing.
So I looked to Gabe, because we work together a lot. I really love working with my husband. And I said, what do you think?
Is there a kid's book here?
Yeah.
And we kind of like talked through a little bit of stuff and pretty quickly realized that just the experience of most harvesters is a really beautiful story in its simplest form. Generally, people go out with either their parent or a grandmother, and it's this process of being in this environment and then having the opportunity to learn. It's not like this formal thing where you go out and it's like, this is what we're doing now and this is what we're going to teach you. But it's more of a life way. And I think fairly quickly realized that could be a story.
Yeah, like the actions in this book are not unfamiliar to us. It wasn't like we had to imagine something we never had done before. This is our story as well. This is a lot of Wabanaki people's stories. Everything that happened in this book happened to people or happened to us. So it wasn't something we had to reach very far to think about. We just had to know how to write a children's story.
Yeah. that was the
hard part.
Because it's not something we thought about.
And that's what I was going to ask when you talked about you had never really thought about writing a children's book. So once you started, how did you do it? Did you start with, like you say, you're familiar with the subject. So did you start with any research at all? Or did you start with trying to imagine what the scenes would be and then going out and experiencing those things that you might create scenes with? And again, maybe for people who don't know, your daughter, Muskan, am I saying her name right?
Musquan,
who is 8 years old. She is in the book. So did you bring her out with you and then, I don't know, take notes on what her reactions were?
I want to say, I'm so glad you tried to pronounce the name. I just hope that it's Passamaquoddy. And so we wanted people to attempt to try it, to try to form your mouth around a word that was unfamiliar, but actually is extremely familiar in a lot of ways, because the signs we see in Maine, the roadways, they're all actually Wabanaki, some Penobscot, Passamaquoddy in origin. So there are words you have said before, potentially, but just not maybe said in the right tonality or
in that way.
Yeah. So thank you for trying to pronounce the word. And I love it when I hear people trying to pronounce it. I was an English speaking, I was raised in English speaking family. So when I tried to start learning Passamaquoddy, it was a challenge to figure out how to do it. So I like other people doing it.
But to answer your question, this research had been going on for years before we were asked about the book. And we're 2 working parents, so oftentimes Musquan would be in the salt marsh, either on a baby sling, or when she learned to walk, trying to get her to stay out of the puddles of the murky mud,
the stenchy,
salt free bog water. So yeah, she had been out there for years already, and it's that sort of thing where you just go out and you learn to experience the environment. And yeah.
First, though, I would say our first step was I Googled, how do you write a kid's book? What are some top lessons? Because we didn't know how to move forward. We had to kind of do our little research on.
And what did you find? What did you find from those?
The basic format was the child has to be the main character. Like, or like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Like the center. Yeah, right. You see the world through the child, not the adult telling the child things, but the experience through the child's eyes. And we're like, oh, okay.
And then also the child has to find some way to overcome whatever obstacle that they meet, whatever it's giving the child agency.
Oh, yeah. And that was really it. The two main things that we stuck to.
Yeah. That was the main structure of the story. And then from there, we're like, well, what sort of problems do you meet? I mean, because there's like, patience. The salt marsh is an incredibly unforgiving environment. It's hot. There's bugs. There's also, amongst the sweetgrass, there's grass that is razor grass that can cut you.
Wow.
So there's a lot of things that make it uncomfortable. And so like, is it a story about her becoming comfortable? And then we just sort of like went back to what it was like learning. Like, oh yeah, there is that sort of like finding the relationship with the grass. I think that's it. Like once you see it, that's all you can see. And it is the sort of like creating a connection. And I think that's sort of like at the heart of Indigenous ecological knowledge anyway, is finding that connection with your environment in a real emotional way.
But that can also be sort of taught to other people, right? That's a message that other people can understand, just not Native people. Right? We all can find relationships in different ways with our natural world, and they do feed something in us.
And I was going to ask you about your own experience, if you could talk maybe each about your own experience with sweetgrass as a child, like, sort of the importance of it in Native culture in Maine, and sort of how each one of you got introduced to it. And then again, looking through children's eyes, right? Your own eyes when you were a child, sort of what it was like. Because when you talked about, things that people can relate to, when I think of bringing a little kid out to do something like harvesting anything, I think of it as being probably a long, arduous process in which the child is going to say, I don't like this, I am bored, I want to leave. So I guess two things: the importance of sweetgrass, the place it has in Wabanaki culture, and then sort of what you remember about being introduced to harvesting sweetgrass as kids.
Yeah. Well, I grew up with my mother making baskets. And so my house always smelled like sweetgrass. And there was always this, even before, like when I was really, really little, before I ever went out, there would be this time of the year when my mother would come home from harvesting sweetgrass. And then there's a tool called a sweetgrass comb, where you comb out the dead parts of the grass. And so that fresh, fragrant smell of sweetgrass would just permeate the entire house. And I remembered that very distinctly. And then when there were times when she couldn't get childcare or anything like that, there was those moments, like the same thing in the book, like being in this really hot environment and then going down below the grass close to the earth and feeling that coolness of the earth and the difference in temperature, and actually getting to see like the different colors of the roots. And yeah, so I think learning that was really just a process of being with my mother out there. And like you say, it was uncomfortable, it was boring. And after a certain point, that became something to do.
It was really great. Recently, we spent time with some second and third graders, and we were talking about this book, and somebody asked a question was, how old do you have to be before you can learn to pick sweetgrass? And Gabe's response was perfect.
So I answered his question by saying, well, how old do you have to be to go to the grocery store with your parents? And they were all like, oh, the kids were like, I don't know. One was like 18, 12, 5. I was like, well, if you asked your mom, do you think she'd take you now? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, so if you wanted to help her actually like take groceries off the shelf, do you think that she'd show you? And they're like, yeah. So I was like, so sweetgrass is the same thing. It's what your family is doing anyway. and you can choose to participate in any way that you want. You just have to ask.
Yeah, so like trying to demystify the practice itself. Not that we want to produce a bunch of sweetgrass harvesters, so this is a native tradition, but we do want to demystify sort of what the idea of being native is, right? Like to grow up being Native American is not that different than other children. These actions that we have. But for me, I wasn't raised picking sweetgrass. My mother wasn't a picker, and so I was exposed to it more with our youth programs with our nation, with our tribe. But it wasn't really until I started doing research that I was really intimate with the grass. Like I was there like every day, getting on my hands and knees and counting sweetgrass stems from, a bunch of other grass. And so all summer long. So for about 3 or 4 years, I was in it.
Would have all kinds of like grass cuts on her fingers when she
Yeah.
And how did you come to sweetgrass, and specifically as part of your research, as part of your PhD studies? How did you come to pick that and focus on that?
Well, I wouldn't say I picked it. It kind of chose me a little bit. I have 2 projects I work on. One is to create sort of EAB response tools, our emerald ash borer that's in Maine, that's affecting our black ash stands. I was helping to create tools for our emerald ash borer response plan. So I do GIS mapping and remote sensing sort of work that typically sort of still do a similar thing of like weaving Indigenous knowledge and Western science and figuring out how to create management tools. And so my friend was working in Acadia. She had just started on this project where national parks had a federal rule change that before 2016 you couldn't pick anything in the park. Nobody could really. There wasn't any sort of rule that allowed that, and other than like a handful of berries or some mushrooms, but really any sort of picking more than that was not allowed. And so in 2016 there was a federal rule change that now federally recognized tribes can enter into plant gathering agreements with national parks. So, but to have that pass, to move through to a approved agreement, you have to jump through some science hoops. You have to have an environmental assessment conducted and a finding of no significant impact. Like all of these things that Native people don't have, really. We don't have many studies that support our practices that are just showing what Native people do. So we kind of knew this was coming, and there was a thought that maybe we needed to do more to support that. Or my friend Michelle, who's a scientist as well, and she actually was living with us. And so it was just like, she said, I need help. Do you want to help me? So I said, okay, sounds amazing. Yeah, I do want to help you. And so, yeah, we're still going. It's been a 4-year project to restore Wabanaki sweetgrass gathering.
It's been incredible too, like to have the science done in a very sciencey way. It's not a sciencey term, but to have that like hard science back what Indigenous people have known for generations. And it's just a confirmation. At one of our gatherer meetings, Suzanne and Michelle were presenting their research, and like they were talking about the statistics over the course of the 3 years, and then all of a sudden they hear this like clapping and cheering, and just because of that, like when you're denied access for so long and then have access to science that backs up what you've said, the gatherers were actually cheering statistics.
Wow.
It's pretty incredible.
And Gabe, so with your basket making, and maybe I'm ignorant, but is sweetgrass the same thing as the black ash that you use, or is it a different material altogether?
Yeah, so traditionally sweetgrass was braided into cordage, or added into lids, or it was part of the material that would go into the basket, but they were for fancy baskets.
I see. So it wouldn't be the main body of the basket, wouldn't be made out of sweetgrass.
No, and it's also it's a spiritual medicine for us. So before it was in baskets, it was sort of like, it was an additive on baskets as a like a spiritual component is to that as well.
Oh, wow. And one thing I really wanted to ask, since your daughter, well, I guess both your daughters are mentioned in the book, right? Isn't Alamoset, who is 4, and she's mentioned in the book too, right? Although not
Yes.
throughout the book. But I wondered what either one of them thinks of the book. Like, do they bring it to school? Do they show it to friends? Did they talk about it?
Yeah, Musquin is quite the celebrity at her school. The school, Asa Adams bought a copy of the book for each one of the classes. And
Wow.
we heard from one of the teachers that Musquin came up to her and was like, if you want me to sign your book, I don't.
That's great.
So she's very proud of it. And then Alamoset would be like, I'm at the end.
Yeah.
That's great.
I just heard them kind of comparing, like,
Yeah.
Muslim was saying, yeah, but I'm the main character.
Yeah, I know. Alamoset was like, I'm in that book. And
Yeah.
then Musquin would be like, well, you're at the end.
Yeah.
It's that funny. Whole sister hierarchy thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and she is the older sister, right? So I guess she's, and then so the next book has to be more about Alamoset. That's all.
Mhm.
Yep.
And I guess that's a question. As you've done this book and you've gotten reaction from people, have you thought about the possibility of another one? Is there another subject that that presents itself to you guys and what you've been doing?
There were so many. Like, as we were writing this book and trying, like, we are also limited by the number of words we could have. And as we're talking about it, we're like, oh, you know what? And we could include this in there. And we're like, well, that's really big. That could actually be its own separate story. And then as we're going along again, we're like, oh, wait, we could include this in there. We're like, that's actually a bigger component. So a lot of ideas, I wouldn't say manuscripts, but a lot of ideas sort of like snowballed out of just that process of creating this story. I mean, because I feel like there is so much richness within the culture that can be shared, and that can be very additive to today's culture.
What are some of the ideas that popped up, and would they be for children's stories too, for children's books?
Yes. Yeah. That's really the only medium we've really thought about working in.
It's also easy because we can picture our girls going through these different things and having these experiences. Maybe when they're teenagers, we'll write Indian Twilight. Just kidding. That's not a thing.
That's great. Yeah. One story we have that we're sort of working on is actually the main character is Alamoset. And it's around language and the use of language in Passamaquoddy is very different than in English. But it's a child that sort of feels alienated. Well, feels different because she has a native name, and that's actually also a typical story. We know a lot of people that had native names and kind of always wish they had an English name to kind of fit in better sometimes. So because they just always felt different, and so just a story about that and how she learns all the different meanings of her name.
And the cultural importance of carrying on language.
Yeah.
And how much of our culture is embedded within the language, our philosophy and worldview. It's really intrinsically tied to the way that even like the names that we have, they're not objective. Like Alamoset means hummingbird, but its literal translation, I mean, number one, there is no literal translation, but the closest translation into English is like the little one that is constantly darting around. So, and that was her action, even in utero, she was always very quick moving. And then while Musquin does mean clear blue sky, it's actually referring to the moment when clouds open up and you can see clear blue sky after a storm.
Wow.
So it's not like, and a lot of that is sort of things that are passed down through that oral tradition. So nothing is like objective in our language. There's not a word for a thing. It's always like what it does and how you relate to it And does that make sense?
So like the place names that we see in Maine now, like they would signify perspective. They would signify something that happened there or something that you do in that location. So there's always sort of some sort of instruction, information, and sort of the word.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if each of you could just mention sort of where you grew up in Maine and sort of what that community was like. And then I was going to ask a little bit about your own remembrances of whether or not, you know, and I imagine you didn't, but whether or not you had books, you know, when you were kids that gave you some perspective or view of other Native American kids, and sort of what that was like. But first, just if you could talk a little bit about sort of where you guys grew up and what those communities were like when you were growing up.
Well, I grew up between Zibayig and Medakmeguk, which is in English is Pleasant Point and Indian Township, Princeton. And we were literally between both of those reservations at different periods in time. Zibayig is a peninsula that's right on the ocean. It's got ocean on both sides of it. And Township is a peninsula as well, but it's surrounded by lake and river. And there's a traditional, they call it the ancestors paddle, where they actually travel from Medakmeguk all the way down to Zibayig using the St. Croix River. But yeah, growing up there was really always close to nature. Like you always, like, you know, whether you're in the river or out in the woods or, yeah.
I'm from so the Holton Maine area. So the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians is on the Medexnicag River, which is a tributary to the St. John. And we have like 7 other reserves in Canada and Quebec. So we're really sort of, but also Maliseet and Passamaquoddy are very similar. Like there's a lot of people who are both. And so while my tribal citizenship is with Maliseet, I'm also a Passamaquoddy. But for us, I think it was slightly different. I think we didn't have a reservation. We didn't have a land base until mid 80s. We weren't, you know, so we didn't have, oftentimes the nations that had those things, like Penobscot and Passamaquoddies, were really, because they were closest to settlers in England, you know, the European sort of culture and treaties and relationships in coastal towns. The further north you got, you know, we didn't have a reservation. So our land base, it was much more fluid. And that in some ways, I think they were able to keep their language really strong. Passamaquoddy language in their communities is really strong. For us in Holton is not as strong, but over in Canada, in Tobic Reserve and other reserves, our language is really strong there. So I didn't grow up with a strong language base. But, you know, and that doesn't make me less Native, right? Oftentimes, like we use these sort of markers or this like summation of check marks to see how Native you are. Like that's often gets pushed onto us a little bit. Like, can you speak your language? Do you have these sort of physical characteristics that really look like a Western Indian, like a Western American Indian? And, you know, and so, yeah, anyway, so we didn't have those growing up, but I don't know, I feel like we had a strong basket making tradition in our communities. There was, you know, we have a really beautiful ash and we go there still, there's this connection to nature. People still lived off the land. Yeah. They were still Native people trying to make it in an environment that wasn't really like made for them.
Yeah.
Right. You know,
and also to the second part of your question, a lot of those imposed views of what it is to be Native are from books about Native people written by non-Native people. And that was pretty prevalent. I mean, I did not grow up with books. My mother was a single mother of 4 very energetic boys. So no, she wasn't, she didn't have the time to like read us stories at night, or connect us with literature that might be enriching.
But when you talk about the view, like you say, the view of what a Native American is, sort of comes out for years in pop culture, right, and in literature, from the viewpoint of white people, and so I wondered, growing up, what kind of effect that had on you. I mean, when you saw movies, and really, I would imagine the only sort of characters that were supposed to be Native Americans were going to be Indians in South Dakota in 1850 in a 1940s Western, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, the first time I really bumped up against that was, I think it was third or fourth grade. We had a project where we did pen pals. And I remember being asked by my pen pal if I lived in a teepee, if it was all of these things that are straight out of a Western. And it sort of was like, wait, so even at that age, I was like, if I'm not matching up to these Hollywood images of an Indian, because I live in a house and I don't ride a pony to work or to school, is that sort of like, does that diminish my Indianness? And like, so there is this sort of like dominant society of pushing your identity onto you. Like, what if you don't, and that still happens. Like, if you don't match somebody's unrealistic expectation of being Native, then they're somehow disappointed. And as I've grown, I've learned to accept my own sort of thing and not accept other people's thing.
Yeah,
a lot of times when people ask me my Indian name, I'll say I don't tell a lot of people, but it's Gabriel.
Yeah, I think it's about like I mean, I think this is a human issue anyways, but like instead of having the external validation, learning to separate the external validation to what's internally inside, how you identify yourself, what is your community, your cultural connections, the things that your community tells you anyways, to pay attention to those lessons and not necessarily the
outside culture.
Right. And also we end up becoming teachers. Like, it wasn't necessarily something we probably both thought that we would be in our adult life, but the positions that we've taken or the jobs we have end up become educators of all there's a lot of different components that that the majority of us are not taught, right? Like Maine history, like the fact that Wabanaki people are still here, all of those, the historical sort of dealings that happened and around the land and technology and from all of those things, we often Native people get pigeonholed into one time frame. And it's this unrealistic idea of what it is to be Native, right? This primitive person that's, just kind of like haphazardly living off the land and just was too ignorant or not smart enough, to really know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And
so when you guys were kids, then it was safe to say you wouldn't have had books that showed the specific, perspective that you could share, the kind of book that you were trying to write for your kids didn't exist, I would imagine.
And even like, because there were also, there's so many like well-meaning people. Like even in our school, the children's books that had to do with Natives were either from an outside perspective or of a pre-European version of Native American. So even then you were like, you're a prehistoric, and they're all models that don't line up to being a member of the Wabanaki Confederacy in Maine.
Right.
So
that shows like the resiliency, the adaptation, the beauty of who we are today. And I think that's what we wanted to kind of be a core of our kids' book.
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
to us is what it means. It's like this practice is one that has expanded generations. Yeah, and we wanted to show that it's still happening. Like,
Yeah.
it's a simple practice. It's not some sort of, mystical approach, but it's just a simple practice that really is the core of our philosophies. Or it's a practice that shows the extension, I think, of our philosophies. And
Yeah. I mean, then there
Yeah.
are so many little things like the moment when Alamusit or when Musquan centers herself and finds the sweetgrass, she first sees her ancestors. This is an experience that other harvesters have had, where when you're in a place that generations of your family have been in and practicing the same practice with the same materials, there's that cyclical nature to time that you sort of like, you can experience that. I think there's something very powerful about that. And we wanted to have that included in that story because that is that sort of like talking about the fact that we have been doing this for thousands of years.
that our ancestors are here with us, guiding us. And that's a true belief.
Yeah.
Native people, it wasn't like a made up idea.
And do you guys feel like there are more Native Americans living in Maine starting to write books from that perspective than there used to be, or maybe they're just more apparent to people, and maybe why is that? I guess
I think that there's more opportunity to be heard because we have been telling our stories, and we have been like, we come from an oral tradition. We've been telling our stories all the way through. I think something is happening in the larger society where there's room to listen.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Native people are writing more. I would say there's always been Native writers. There's always been Native people telling stories, expressing our worldview, teaching, but it's the opportunities. And we have learned more so that the publishing world is quite white, quote unquote. I don't know, and that they are the gatekeepers to what gets published. There's a lot of gatekeepers that are, in this publishing world.
Yeah, that deem what's worthy of being amplified.
Yeah. And so I think that's shifting. Yeah.
So what are some of the things that are shifting that, or as you said, Gabe, that are creating more opportunities for people to listen or to be heard? What are some of the things that you see, both, I guess, maybe culturally, throughout the country, or even just here in Maine? Are there certain things that are helping that?
I mean, I can't speak to the entire whys, because it's obviously something that's happening on a much larger scale. I think that some of the things that have been happening nationally, like I mean, in recent years, but also like the DPL pipeline got so much attention. The things with the uncovering mass graves at boarding schools, just the social injustice that's occurred everywhere. I think it's becoming something that's not anecdotal, and it's not one person's experience, and it's getting harder to ignore those types of inequities that are built into our society. And yeah, those are things that we've known and have talked about for a long time, and now I think people are starting to hear. So I don't know all of the whys at all, but it is noticeable that instead of nitpicking people's experiences into, well, that's just something that you're experiencing, or that's just your opinion. No, it's something that's happening not only nationally but globally, right? The imbalances in our system have been sort of brought into the light.
And I think there's been small steps, like in the environmental world, to like recognize the relationship, the perspective of Native people with the landscapes, that it wasn't, these were active management. Native people actively managed landscape pre-Europeans to produce this abundance, right? Europeans didn't come here and was like, oh, the fish are so great. Like, how'd that happen, right? That's, I think there's a growing understanding that actually they were through choices Native people made, and from living from this place for 12,000 years plus, that produced this sort of, this relationship, right? So that relationship is what exists with sweetgrass as well, is that Native people say that we need the sweetgrass and the sweetgrass needs us. That the way we pick sweetgrass actually encourages growth. It makes it better. And that's that's relationship, that reciprocal relationship that exists. And I think there's a recognition of that perspective and approach is actually really beneficial, and it might help to curb or understand climate change adaptation, or not understand the climate change adaptation. Like, there's a growing movement in science to understand indigenous knowledge, but not just the knowledge it's not just to extract the knowledge from Native people, but that it's the Native practice and the people attached with the knowledge together that produces this response and this result. There's Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, that has been really, really popular. And that's a similar story about that relationship between plants and people. And I think there's something internal that people want as well. Like, that it's not just like, how can you be Native? It's more like, how can you have a relationship to the landscape yourself? How can you, through your own lens, connect and have repeated experiences in a similar fashion?
Yeah.
It used to be like, we used to get calls sometimes and be like, I feel like I'm Native American because I love the outdoors. You're like, wait, no.
That's not how that works.
You can love the outdoors.
It's okay just to like nature. It's fine.
Yeah. Lots of people probably like the outdoors. Yeah.
It's not a cultural thing.
And when you talk about the connection with the land, one of the things, Gabe, that sort of fascinates me is the fact that you're a 12th generation basket maker. Like, I can't even imagine going back 12 generations in my family, but it's 12 generations in your family in the same place, basically in what is now Maine.
Place. Yeah, well, in what is now Zibayig Nagadakmaguk. Our creation story is centered around the black ash tree. And growing up, my grandfather would always say, if you can make a basket, you'll never go hungry. And, as a teenager, you hear that and you're like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, if you can cook, you'll never go hungry. But for him, that was a reality. Like, he was a fisherman, he was a carpenter, he was a basket maker, and the basket making really allowed him to not succumb to federal pressure to assimilate. And that's a huge aspect. So in our stories, we talk about the importance of the black ash tree to our culture. But within that, there's the importance of the black ash tree to our cultural survival, because there's so much embedded within those teachings. That's the same thing. Like, that reciprocal relationship with the sweetgrass, that extends to most of the things that we harvest.
And when you say that making the baskets allowed him to not have to bend to federal pressure to assimilate because of the money he made from the baskets, the economics.
Yeah, because you weren't, so like, there was a federal policy where there was an Indian agent placed on every reservation, and their job was to disperse rations. But what they were actually doing was monitoring. And if you were showing that you were a good Indian and that you were adopting farming and, dressing appropriately and not using your language, then you would get rations, which were actually money that the federal and state governments stole. Then you would get those. And if you didn't, if you still hunted, if you still practiced, if you still spoke your language, then those would be withheld and you could starve to death.
Wow.
So there was an active policy, like, this is like, kill the Indian, keep the man. that was across the United States and Canada.
It's not like these were evil people doing it. They genuinely thought that they were helping, right? Like progress. You know, these were like good Christian people helping out these foolish Indians who just are holding on to some way that's not going to serve them.
So this is kind of where we get to the fact that there's a lot of Mainers who've never been exposed to this history.
Yeah.
Like the fact the state of Maine a lot of the state of Maine was held in treaty rights for Native people, and the state of Maine like illegally sold a lot of that land. This was the basis for our land claims in 1980.
Was a slow rectification of that theft and illegal sale.
Well, actually, I think it's the time, I think, in the discussion where I'm going to move on to questions from people who are watching, so we have enough time to get in all the questions. The first one is just, and this is helpful to you guys probably, people want to know where they can buy the book, where they can get it.
At your local bookstore.
It's just everywhere.
Yeah, if you want to go to Amazon, you can go to Amazon. I don't think they have great human rights record, but you can do that.
But we like supporting local small businesses.
Yeah, we really appreciate if you could go to your local business, your local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, they can order it.
Right.
They can order it from Tilbury House. So yeah.
And Tilbury House is in, where are they? They're right in Maine too, right? Thomaston, that's right. Thomaston.
Yeah.
And somebody has a question that says, excuse me, is it a powerful and somewhat healing feeling to successfully provide a resource, your book, that is essential but absent in children's literature? So I guess how it makes you feel.
I would say that's a good summation.
I would say, yeah, but there's more to that.
Yeah. I know, I want it to be brief.
Oh, what's been really powerful is how our community has received it.
Yeah, my mother wept the first time she heard it. And honestly, for me, when I did my first couple of readings, I would choke up. I would have a really hard time getting through the entire story, reading it out loud. And I think there is something deeply cathartic of expressing something that's deeply held in your culture and having it manifest into a book that that people really appreciate. I think, yeah, it's pretty incredible.
And the next question says, I myself am Maliseet, but I'm adopted and have no connection with my biological father. I just got enrollment in the Holton Band of Maliseets in October. I don't know nearly enough about Maliseet culture, traditions, etc. What resources are available to me as an adult to connect more with the tribe?
I would say the tribe. There's an annual powwow and celebration every year. So start coming up, start engaging, start seeing people, see people, talk to people. I mean, books are great. I'm not down in books.
As an author. But I mean, part of Indigenous identity is about those kinship roles and reciprocity and being part of a community, right? Those are deeply held values.
Yeah, volunteer to help elders. Like those are the ways that you connect with people.
Yeah.
Volunteer at these events.
And this next question, I'm not sure if this is about your research, but the question is, how much does data sovereignty play in the dynamic of being Native and also partaking in more Western science methods for your projects? Have you hit bumps when it comes to the exposure of traditional ecological knowledge in your work, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that one's for you.
I mean, there's a deeper answer that I could go on about, but yeah, it's extremely important. Data sovereignty is something that we're always very thoughtful about. And we have certain sort of mechanisms that ensure that Indigenous knowledge doesn't become owned by somebody else. And we also work with the IP lawyer to help write these protocols and understandings between National Park Service and the Wabanaki sweetgrass gatherers.
Yeah, but also specifically in relating to writing this book, it's not a how-to. Like what we described is very general. So it's not, there's a whole lot that's not in the book and wouldn't be.
You can try to go find sweetgrass in a salt marsh, but unless you know it.
Unless you're shown by someone.
Yeah.
And this next question starts with the word QEY.
It's Quay.
Quay. Have you considered translating the entire book into Passamaquoddy? It would be wonderful having this as a bilingual book. And then the final word is Wolawan, W-O-L-I.
That's hello and thank you.
Oh, okay.
That's a great idea, actually. I wonder if we could get Tilbury House to do that. Call to action.
Would it be hard, or would it be, or is
it would be hard?
Yes, it would be hard.
It's hard to switch the verb sort of structures into Passamaquoddy. Like they're different sentence structures.
Because it's also like most other languages, it goes in the reverse, like how the phonics is set up, and there's not word for word translations for things.
But I think people could do it with a lot of work.
Yeah. Whoever that was, get a grant. We'll do it.
Okay. And the next question, which I think is more of a comment, it seems this change is part of the spiritual reawakening of the world. We need to learn from the indigenous cultures. Your relationship with the land will help save us from ourselves. So I guess there's not a question, they're just commenting. But the next question is there a specific spiritual significance associated with sweetgrass aside from its functionality in basket making and cordage? And I think you talked about that a little bit, but spiritual significance.
Yeah,
it's part of a mix of what we consider to be sacred herbs. It's like they say it brings in joy. Like some sort of like transmute negativity, some ground you, some cleanse, and that's said to bring in joy.
Or invite it.
Invited in, yes, not bring. It's not forceful in any way.
And the next one just wants to know if you are open to doing readings. And I guess I'll ask, have you done many readings, and how do those go?
Well, honestly, yes and no. We've done a couple of readings, but we're still struggling pandemic wise, like for time.
Yeah.
We've had to start saying no only because we both have other jobs. It's been really our struggle to find time for us right now.
Yeah. At this point, we don't have time to do readings.
Which makes me feel a little sad, honestly, because I would love to be able to read the story to people, but
I just did a reading at a school in Bangor, and it was my first time. Like, I had done public readings, but it was my first time reading a story to 6 little kids. And they were like, I started reading, and they're like, wait, you didn't say the title page. Who's the author? Like,
right, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right.
It was really sweet, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Do Native people welcome it when non-Native people want to learn indigenous ways, and how to begin?
No. Sorry.
I mean, some people do.
Some people do.
Number one, we're also just one Native person.
Yeah.
Each,
so I would say that there is, I think in a much more, I guess, thought out answer is when you're part of a culture that has been systematically erased for generations, and then finally allowed to even have your religious ceremonies, and then the dominant culture wants to take it, that feels like appropriation, and it feels very inappropriate. But there are people who are open to teaching everyone.
Are there certain areas where you'd feel personally more comfortable, like sharing the culture? Like the next question is, this person would like to teach their Maine family more about Native culture through food and cooking.
Oh,
And
Yeah,
that's
that's
different.
yeah, that's great.
you know,
No, that's
would you
great.
have
Yeah.
recommendations for that? They want to know, would you have recommendations for where to learn about food and cooking?
Do they do things in Nebison?
I think a little.
There's a little bit in there's a place up just north of
Pasadumkeg.
yeah, just south of Pasadumkeg, Nebison. And they are trying to get a lot more programming with those types of things, like educating, not necessarily teaching about a lot of the specifics of Native culture. The Abbey Museum is an incredible resource in Bar Harbor. If you want to learn and teach more about Wabanaki culture.
I would say though, the food and cooking is hard a little bit to find resources for that. Like, I think we're just starting to work on more food sovereignty programs in our communities. We have certain traditional foods that we still eat. It's not always widespread, I would say. And some of them are like the larger sort of larger game animals or fish or that.
Fiddleheads.
You know, there was, I think one generation back, there was a lot of like eating beaver and muskrat.
Porpoise.
And a certain way of harvesting those or a certain way of cooking those that are really particular. We don't have that as much.
Yeah.
It happens once in a while, but like, so there's things that have changed over time and it's hard to kind of, I don't know. I think it's coming back slowly, but I don't know. It's like,
there's also like, not necessarily for Wabanaki, but there have been some indigenous chefs across the country who are like Michelin star chefs who have come home and indigenized culinary cuisines in really incredible ways.
we need some of those.
Yeah.
Hey, there's some really great Instagrammers though. There's
The Mohawks.
look up sort of like if you're on Instagram, hashtag indigenous chefs.
Yeah.
I found a couple and I forget their names, but there's one in Portland that's Penobscot and they do a lot of different things.
Anyway, yes.
That's a personal thing.
And
you-
in Portland, here in Portland, Maine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can buy some products from Native people. I buy corn from a Haudenosaunee man, and he smokes it puts it in lye, and then he sells it as hominy or cornmeal or masa. You have to do kind of a lot of work to figure out to find the places to get that stuff. It's not easily found.
Yeah.
It sounds like you may have to go all over the state too. Maybe not down here in Cumberland County as much.
Right.
As some places. And then the last question that we have so far is just, are you familiar with the writing of Kent Nurburn? Nurburn?
No.
No, I don't know that one either. Well, that's the last question. Oh, actually a follow-up question from somebody who says they are disabled and don't drive and live in Hallowell. So some of your previous advice about how to connect with the Maliseets would be hard for me. Do you have any other suggestions for someone like me?
That's a difficult one.
I mean, I would say if you have Facebook, look at Nebison's Facebook.
They're close.
They have some different sort of language lessons and story time. There's some digital story time that's happening.
And what is the organization to look for? Or
Nebison, how do you spell?
yeah, how do you spell that?
I'm gonna sound it out on here.
Okay.
Because it's the whole like speaking phonetically.
It's Nibezun.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully that'll help. And this question is, First Light Learning Journey is one effort between Land Trust and the Wabanaki Alliance to develop that understanding mentioned earlier. One must proceed at the speed of trust is one guide. Are there other suggestions?
I would say come in as a student.
Yeah.
Be a student. don't be somebody coming in that has an ego or that we really work at being an open book.
Yeah, a lot of people approach helping with a prescriptive sort of like, this is what you need.
Yeah.
And that never produces good results. Because again, and we said this multiple times, it's all about relationships. It really is. That's the core of that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys very much. I think it's 8 o'clock, which is our appointed time to end. And this has been really interesting. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk to us and talk to everybody out there. I'd like to thank Suzanne and Gabriel and their children because they're in the book. They're in the book too. And I think we have the links on where to find the First Blade of Sweetgrass. I see one here is at Sherman's bookstore. You can find it. So hopefully people will seek it out. Thank you guys both very much. And thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.